Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Gayamargo land, a part of the Aurora Nation, by myself, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. It's the first interview from these new digs people will be seeing. I'm in a new office, but I'll explain all that another place, another time. But because nothing about me is important today because I have a wonderful guest back on the show, Professor Anthony Reddie. Anthony, welcome so much. Welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat. Welcome back.
Indeed, well, it's a pleasure to be here.
So we're going to talk today because your book, Is God Colorblind, has had a re-release with a new afterword and a new edition, and so I'm really excited to talk about that. But I guess for folks who maybe aren't familiar with you, haven't come across your work before, what does your work look like? I mean, obviously, you're working from home now, like a lot of folks, but where do you find yourself working? What are the kind of things that fill your work days for those who are interested in knowing that?
Yeah, well, I've had quite a significant change in my work in the last year or so. So maybe just slightly before, well, last January I started a new job in Oxford University, which is a fairly remarkable kind of experience to be in, largely because I never imagined myself as a Black liberation theologian, especially someone who in his first degree did atrociously in his first degree. Because my first degree, I didn't work that hard. So what I often tell students is, there's always redemption. There's always a chance to kind of turn it around. So as an undergraduate student, I was pretty poor. So the idea that I would end up working in Oxford University as an academic seems ridiculous, but that's where I am. So I direct the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. That's part of Regent's Park College. That's one of the colleges that makes up Oxford University. And I guess in a curious way, my life is kind of divided between the formalism of the academy in terms of being in Oxford with its very, very academic, rigorous forms of teaching, which actually I really enjoy. But alongside that, I'm essentially an activist. So the writing I do is not primarily or solely focused on the academy, but it's about how do we empower people, or particularly on the margins, how do we transform their thinking, how do we get people to think in terms of acts of solidarity with each other in order to challenge empire and imperialism and capitalism and all the various isms that impact on people's lives and constrict their realities and their opportunities, like for full growth and to be and the full life that Jesus talks about in John 10:10. So really, that's been very much really the work of the last 20 odd years. Really, it's been this this activist mode of Black liberation theology, using particularly sort of decolonial, transformative forms of critical pedagogy, both to challenge ideas and concepts and theories, but also like to challenge people and to challenge structures and systems and practices. So that's really been very much what I've been about.
Thank you for that. That's great. And when I had you on a while ago now to talk about Theologizing Brexit, your book there, that's very much what that book is dealing with too. The undercurrents that not exactly this account of how Brexit happened, but the undercurrents that led and were relied upon for Brexit to happen in terms of racialized and colonialized attitudes, ideas of British exceptionalism that needed to be, critiqued through a theological lens in order to be understood. And I guess, as you say there, you're challenging systems and structures and you're challenging individuals. And I guess, now we come to this book, Is God Colorblind? And I think, that's really a very personally directed thing at a lot of folks for many who believe, who would say that, yes, of course God is colorblind because God sees the heart and God knows all God's dear children, and color is something that we are imposing in terms of value and stuff like that. So I guess, for those who've never come across the book, let alone its newer edition, I guess what kind of drew you to writing this book then, and then maybe what leads to now in the revision and the afterword?
Yeah. So in terms of the initial version, it came really from a very specific story. So I was doing a workshop in South London. That's called Brixton. So Brixton is historically been seen as, I guess, the capital of Black Britain. I guess, really, because that's when the Windrush generation, people who came from the Caribbean islands, that part of the British Empire, when they came in the 50s and 60s, one of the first places they settled in large numbers was this particular borough of South London called Brixton. And so I was doing a workshop in a Pentecostal church, and I was talking about Black theology. And I thought it was going really well. And for the most part, people were nodding and smiling in all the right places and laughing at all the appropriate jokes. I thought it was going really, really well. Only to find out I was being lulled into a false sense of security. Because actually, then when it came to the Q&A, people actually were not really that happy. And the thing that really hit me was this young guy, early 20s, who got up and he was really quite distressed. I mean, he almost had, I think he did have tears in his eyes, and said, I found the way in which you keep talking about blackness and being black offensive. I find it problematic. And these are the words I'll never forget. He said, I stopped being black when I was saved. And that stunned me. And my reply, which I've always regretted, and one of the things I wish I could find this guy again, because my reply was, I'm not sure at what point black became so bad that God had to save you from it. Now, whilst I still think that is a fair theological question to ask, putting it that way, I think devalued his own agency, which I regret, because one thing I've always held the view is that everyone has the right to name and describe themselves how they wish. Even if I disagree with it, even if I think, quite frankly, that's the most preposterous thing you've ever said, in terms of how you name yourself. If you're naming yourself, and that's one of the true powers of being a human being, is to name oneself. Other animals get named. That's part of that kind of that process of objectification, but humans name themselves. So if he wants to believe that he has transcended being black because he's been saved, as much as I think that's a problematic statement, that's his right. So I've also regretted that response, but that got me thinking on the train going back to Birmingham. It's a couple hours journey. So what is it about blackness and being black that is so problematic that this guy believes that once he was saved and became a part of the body of Christ and he was redeemed and sanctified and all the usual theological language we use, but particularly around evangelical conversions, that somehow he can now transcend the skin he was in and the political construction that comes with it. And that's what then got me thinking into about kind of writing the book. So I guess one of the reasons I put a question mark is because at one level, we really don't know. What I always say is, is what James Cone says. So James Cone's my all-time hero, and Cone says, theology is human speech about God. God doesn't do theology. God is a subject of theology. God knows God's self, so God doesn't do theology on God's self. We do theology, but we do it, hopefully, with a degree of humility, acknowledging that there's a fundamental gap between what we say about God and who God is in God's self. So no theologian, if they're honest, writes their work with the notion that God's on their shoulder, so whispering into their ear saying, Anthony, this is exactly how it goes. This is this is like the final word on it. That's not what we're doing. So it's question mark, is God colorblind? And I guess part of it, the answer depends upon how you interpret the significance of color, of ethnicity, of quote unquote race, inverted commas, that race doesn't exist as a construct. If we're saying that by acknowledging difference, ethnicity, our epidermis, our appearance, in hierarchical terms, i.e., so you're a white man in Australia, that makes you superior to me. That makes you superior, let's say, to Aboriginal and other First Nation peoples, which we know is a legacy of racism and empire and colonialism. If that's how we're construing difference, then clearly God is colorblind. God is not buying into those constructs that are creating hierarchies based upon skin pigmentation and the political and social significance and theological significance of those things, with white at the top and Black African at the bottom and various other mixes in between, which varies on what age you're looking at as to how many categories there are. Because, that because race is a construct and it's made up, people can't even agree on how many races there are. So at various points, it's been 4, been 16 within the Spanish American Empire, like there were 128 so-called races. So, you know, so it's a made-up fiction.
Mm.
Therefore, if we're thinking in terms of ethnicity and race, inverted commas, linked to those forms of empire and colonialism and hierarchy, then God is indeed colorblind. If, however, which is really what I'm trying to say in the book, we say actually, we see them not in hierarchical terms, but we see them as indices of the glorious handiwork of God, that God's handiwork has created this patchwork, this mosaic of difference that is not hierarchical, it fits more together like a jigsaw. That actually, if you put all the pieces together, then what you get is this fantastic picture of humanity in its glorious breadth and depth. And each piece is important. If you don't have that piece, then what you don't have is the full picture. Now, if you see difference in those terms, then God is not colorblind. That God sees those differences because God created them. And therefore, what I was trying to do in the book, if nothing else, was to rehabilitate blackness, to say, actually, there's nothing to be apologetic about it. On the contrary, what Black theology says is that not only do you not transcend blackness when you become saved, actually what you should do is to delve into blackness, because it's in blackness that you find God, that God is revealed in those social constructions that have always been told that they are at best second or third best, and at worst of no significance and consequence whatsoever. So in your context, I have no doubt that if one wants to find the authentic revelation of God, you have to go into marginalized and dispossessed First Nation communities, to go amongst Aboriginals, to go amongst those who have had their identity stolen, those whose children were taken off them by well-meaning white missionaries and given to white families. It's in those places, not in some of the citadels of white colonialism, that you're going to find God. It's going to be in those identities that have been so traduced, and people have felt embarrassed about it, or somehow felt that they had to run away and escape it in order to become respectable. That's what I'm trying to say in the book.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think the other thing that kind of came to mind is, like you mentioned James Cone, and like he would often write about one of the things that, you know, brought him the most critique or the most like questions was his whole thing of, I'm Black before I'm Christian. Like I was Black before I was Christian, like, you know, and that continued. And that is the primary lens through which he, you know, he interprets the world, through which the world engages him. Like, I think of, like, you know, his response in that thing of someone saying, well, I'm no longer Black. It's like, well, the world will see you that way, like, and treat you that way, regardless of how you see yourself. And so Cone, like that, he, you know, there's no, you know, if Cone was more Wesleyan, he'd be like, you know, you can't go, your experience is being Black, and there's no way to go past that, both in the way you experience the text and the way the tradition experiences you. So, but it was interesting thinking about that was so much often the critique leveled at him, that was somehow antithetical to being a Christian, to claim that this other identity held some sort of primary or at least framing place in that discovery and life of faith.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And certainly, I think around the same time I did the initial version of the book, I remember doing an interview. I've been asked that very same question. I was on a gospel show, and the presenter was a relatively conservative Black Christian, and said, well, you know, Cone has said, how would you respond to it? And for some strange reason, the interview, despite the fact that I self-identified as a Black theologian, assumed I would give a different answer to Cone. I'm not quite sure where they got that idea. No, I said, I agree absolutely with Cone. I said, when I was born, I wasn't born a Christian. I was born Black. And when I'm walking down the street and my Black body is perceived as a problem, there's not a sound in my head says, well, oh, I'm Black, but don't worry, I'm a Christian. No, I'm just Black. But actually, the truth is every Christianity is some type of Christianity. So actually seeing the idea sometimes I'm just a Christian is simply not true, because the question then becomes actually, what kind of Christian are you? all of us have a social location. So our Christianity is informed by, whether we're honest about it or not, informed by our social location, informed by our class, ethnicity, culture, political affiliations. All those things feed into, which is why we have such a diversity and multiplicity of churches. I realized that I didn't answer like the second part of the question. So the updated version of the book really came out of the Black Lives Matter movement. So the death of George Floyd last year, 24th of May, or 25th of May, I can't remember which one it is. But anyway, it's one of those 2 days, 25th, I think, last year, that then leads to the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And whereas I think in its first iteration, it was very much a North American conversation, I think this time around, when it was in its resurgence, it became much more of a global movement. And so within the British context, we suddenly had this sudden awareness of the need to talk about race and the need to have a more mainstream conversation. So whereas people like myself have been writing about race and theology for the best part of 20 odd years, for the most part, up until last year, this was always a minority fringe thing that only a few white people were interested in, and maybe a few black people as well. What really surprised me, actually, it was a publisher who came to me and said, oh, by the way, by that point, like, the book had been out of print for several years. And they came back and said, actually, like, we've had this sudden surge of interest in a book that we've deleted. So we're going to republish it. But we were wondering if you'd like to add a section about Black Lives Matter, because also when I first wrote it in 2009, Black Lives Matter didn't exist. So they asked me if I'd like to add a section and to go back through it and just to make some other subtle change. So again, when I wrote in 2009, Trump wasn't around. And actually, it was written at the time of the optimism of Obama in 2009. So clearly that had changed. So I went back and made a few changes, but then added this afterward, which is really just a much more explicit linking of the earlier ideas in the book with Black Lives Matter. And part of it actually really was, I think, just to try and say that we make a mistake if we focus too much upon the extremist actions of that police officer who kills George Floyd. That's not to say it's hugely significant. But the truth is, most ordinary white people don't go around killing other people. Thank God. That is not the norm. Most of us are law-abiding citizens, and we live within our respective societies, and we say that we hold to the existing rule of law that's being created by, whether it's in Australia or in Great Britain. Therefore, what I want to push at is not the extremism, it's the embedded ways in which particular viewpoints and perspectives are set in motion that ends up with the extremist action of a police officer killing George Floyd. But actually, way before you get to that, you have an embedded set of theological ideas, socio-political, cultural ideas that have always seen Black bodies as problematic, as the other. So therefore, even if people are not extremist, they're already existing ideas. So one of the things I talk about in the afterword is growing up in Bradford, which was a post-industrial city in the north, which was, there were no laws that said that people could live here or not live here. So there was no legal segregation, and yet there may as well be, because like you could spot where all the Black and Asian and the migrants lived, because like we all lived in the poorest parts of the city in certain boroughs of the city. And the other parts were literally like the White Highlands, where if you were found walking there, one of two things would happen. Like you'd either get beaten up by the locals, or the police would stop you and ask you what business you had being in this area, given that your type of people don't live here. That was my natural reaction growing up. And the key moment that politicized me, and I share this in the book, was the large evangelical Methodist church I went to. Decided they would support a march. There was a march, I think, in the late 70s to win back the city for Christ. So it was organized through a kind of evangelical kind of missional activity around saving the Christian identity of the city, winning back Christ for the city. But this was very much anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant. So officially it wasn't political, officially it wasn't racist, officially it was about winning for Christ. But it was very clear that these were conservative, right-wing white Christians who wanted their city back because that they were troubled with all the immigrants coming to the city. And what I remember was my mom, who was very much like the beating heart of our family in terms of being its anchor, in terms of both its moral weight of the family, plus she was a fervent and devout Christian. And she said to us, like, we're not going on that march is not about us. And just instinctively, at that point, I thought, oh yeah, because I'm a Black Christian. Okay, I'm part of this church, I'm a Christian. But when they talk about the march to save the city, what they're talking about is to save it from people like us, even though we're Christians and law-abiding. And we pay our taxes and we're respectable. But like we don't really belong. It wasn't a violent march, but it was a march where we're still othered. Therefore, if you understand how that plays into popular culture, how it gets fed now in terms of the media, particularly in terms of social media, how the rise of racist rhetoric and the othering of people who are not part of the mainstream, how that happens now with the proliferation, that long before you get to the violence of George Floyd being murdered, you have the ongoing problematic way in which Blackness is being perceived and understood. Therefore, if you want to talk about the asymmetrical ways in which that's understood, then just think about, even like the so-called moral vision of former President Trump. So peaceful Black people taking the knee, deeply problematic, absolutely abhorred, absolutely condemned. White mob trying to attack and overthrow democracy. These are the people we love you, we care about you, you're very precious to us. Okay, so peaceful people taking the knee are problematic, but white thugs attacking the seat of democracy, not so bad.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, because I think otherwise you can just point to these things and be like, well, I would never do that, and my family, no one in my family would ever do that, and so this isn't about us. And I think you're right, that's important to get at that. One thing I thought of when we were leading up to this interview, and I think it fits well in this, in terms of what's perceived as a threat and what's perceived as problematic, is so a big story in Britain and the church recently was with Reverend Jarrell Robinson Brown, who tweeted about the kind of nationalistic fervor that was surrounding Captain Tom, and as people have said, a salient point, one made by plenty of others, including plenty of white people, but like one that but we saw what the reaction was, the vile threats and abuse on social media, and also not only social media, from mainstream media, and lukewarm to problematic responses from the church body, from the Church of England, from the Diocese of London. But I think in some ways that taps to what you're saying there, is that it's almost this audacity to be Black and to question the ideals of this nation, to question a figure in our past. I mean, I think it fits very well with what you're talking about in from Theologising Brexit, of it's like, these are these attitudes that if you start to poke at them, they can only be read as a vicious, racist assault, and not, maybe a astute critique on the way an individual has been co-opted into a particular kind of movement.
Indeed, absolutely, yeah. I'm pretty sure that at some point in the future, people like myself, and maybe not just me, other people will want to write about this as being a really significant moment in the socio-political framing of identity within Britain, kind of post-Brexit. Because, it's a very, very complex situation in one respect. Was the timing of the original tweet the best? No, probably not. And I know Jarrell very, very well. He apologized, withdrew it very quickly. The original tweet was not attacking Captain Tom at all. On the contrary, it applauded him for his selfless act, and I think ended with my friend saying he would pray for his soul. I mean, it doesn't get any more affirming and respectful than to say that one's going to pray for him as a great individual who's beloved by God. That's what it says. What's interesting in terms of what was effectively a white right-wing electronic lynch mob, is, as you say, it's this question of the tropes around this particular individual. So as a World War II veteran and a hero, Britain's last great hurrah, we still talk about this being our greatest hour. Okay, so whether it is or not, look how long ago that is and how much time has expanded since, but somehow that's still our greatest hour. So we go back to that moment in order to make ourselves feel good. What we're not looking at is the way in which this octogenarian, is that the right 100-year-old person? I can never get these terms right. Anyway, okay, edit that bit out if it's not correct. So a guy who's 100 raises a huge amount of money for our National Health Service, which you have to remind people is not a charity. Okay? It's not a charity. It's something that's meant to be paid for properly through taxation. Therefore, this guy, again, I will reiterate, he's done a fantastic, heroic act. But he then gets co-opted in order to deflect us, firstly, from the inane bungling of this administration, whose incompetence is not the cause of the disproportionate numbers of deaths of Black and Asian and minority ethnic people, but it certainly hasn't helped. That's the first thing. Secondly, is the fact that the National Health Service is not defined by whiteness. It's defined by the fact that a disproportionate number of people are migrants from other places. The ones who get demonized but are doing front-facing public work, vulnerable, underpaid. They're underpaid in an institution that itself is underfunded. But let's clap this guy rather than look at some of the deeper systemic issues. I still remember a friend of mine who works in the health service, person of color, who said, and pardon my French for the expletives, she said, and I quote, "Fuck the clapping, I want a pay rise." That clapping is not going to help me pay for my bills, and the fact is that she works full-time. She's a full-time nurse, recently qualified nurse, who still has to access a food bank in order to feed her children. Full-time person, but still needs a food bank to feed her children. No, let's not talk about that. Let's just clap. And when someone says, well, actually, this clapping is problematic because it disguises and is using a particular form of nostalgia of white nationalism in order to deflect us from the systemic issues that COVID is clearly showing are problematic within our body politic of our nation. Actually, then let's just sort of attack the guy. And if you want to sort of see the nature then of white supremacy, it's all of a sudden him being Black and being gay, which last time I checked had nothing at all to do with the tweet he sent. So even if you don't like the tweet, I'm not sure what him being Black and gay has anything to do with anything about the tweet itself, except, of course, as we know, that the agency of Black people, particularly if you are gay, is somewhat circumscribed. So what's interesting, when I engaged rather foolishly with some of his detractors, who are just some of the mean-spirited, nasty set of right-wingers who have never liked Black and Asian people in Britain. So again, part of what this was about was a way of engaging a type of culture war of people who have always resented our presence in Britain. And the reason I say that is that when I challenged one of them and I said, okay, so what's her 20? His tweet was utterly offensive. It's disgraceful. He should be run out of the church. I said, okay. So let me ask this question. I said, have you ever complained about any of the tweets that Katie Hopkins has put out? Which, quite frankly, on the scale of what Jarrell said, there is no comparison. Yeah, but here's the thing though, you see, white people get a pass. The bar is set so high for her that for her to get death threats requires her pretty much to make some of the most extremist and obnoxious comments. Jarrell, on the other hand, is black and gay, so it's not just that it's black, it's also his sexuality as well. Then suddenly forces him into hiding for a tweet that at the very worst is ambiguous.
Yeah.
It's ambiguous because actually you can read it as offensive or you can read it in a slightly different way. That is very, very different, for example, from a prime minister who has been on record as saying that black people are, who again, where, what's the exact phrase, because I don't want to misquote him, where something with watermelon smiles. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's certainly like it's called Muslim women letterboxes. Somehow that hasn't evoked their ire, but Jarrell's words have. Because as you quite rightly say, black people, we're not meant to have any agency. Our only role within the body politic of the public is pretty much to be quiet and invisible and know our place. All right for us to do menial work, all right for us to be passive and supine when we offer opinions and when we dare to challenge the existing narrative of white nationalism and entitlement, then all hell breaks loose, and breaks loose in a disproportionate way, not in comparison to the kind of things that genuine right-wing racists have said. So again, it was interesting that some of the detractors were saying, well, Jarrell needs to be run out because he's a racist. Yeah, but actual white people who actually are racist, and the ones like you've never complained about.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, what I thought was so often so interesting too, and I think, there'd be parallels here with those who marched in that march that you talked about, the winning the city back for Christ, is how many of them who are, winning it back for Christ, similar to here, who are concerned about the Church of England and who gets to be the priest in these historic buildings, like, are actually in church on a Sunday. Right, or actually have any skin in the game in terms of the life of the church, in terms of the proclamation of the gospel, like all these things. And yet here is, someone who's actually a priest, devoted his life to it, or in your case, your family, actively involved in the local church and serving and being there. That doesn't matter. You're actual, like, you can't actually be more invested in this institution, in the church, than me, even though I maybe show up at Christmas. But how dare you challenge it? Because, it's there for me, not you, even if I'm not there, but it's waiting. And I think, and you've talked about this in other places about, like, who gets to be Christian, like in our mind's eye, in our public discourses, who gets to be that representative, and it's white people, when, that ignores so much of the actual reality of what's going on around, who's actually in churches and who's actually the lifeblood and driving force of creativity and ingenuity in the churches. You were talking about going back to kind of look over the book and make some changes, and you were saying how you kind of went back and it had been written in that post-Obama glow, like and change and hope, and then there's been 10 years of not only potentially Obama not delivering on a lot of the things that people hoped for, and then also the white lash of Trump being elected. So I'm sure there's both this disheartening mode when you go back, but then at the same time, you're going back because this resurgence of Black Lives Matter and people want to engage this book, and yet all like books of a various stripe that are addressing race are flying off shelves. So there's also like, well, maybe it's changing again. So I'm wondering about like that kind of dual modes, and whether you're kind of like, okay, am I just setting myself up to be disappointed that if I come back in 10 years, it'll be like, hey, remember those movements that we were all hopeful and something else happened instead? Yeah,
I mean, I think there's always been for me two different modes of thinking that are always kind of running parallel to each other, really. On the one, I think in terms of social movements, I've always understood that it's probably best understood in metaphorical terms like a pendulum. So the pendulum swings. It swings from left to right, from right to left, and we have different moments. So during Britain, like we had like the Blair era, and certainly someone who was a member of the Labour Party has left it and rejoined it several times. I mean, over the years, because it's just one of those relationships that kind of does sort of set me up for optimism one moment and then despair on the next. So and therefore, like the Obama moment was one of those where the pendulum swung in one direction, and we thought that what we was seeing was maybe the herald of a more progressive, a more enlightened, a more equitable way of being human beings. And the church had an important role in that. I mean, Obama's community organizing came out of his association with the Church of Jeremiah Wright in Chicago, a United Church of Christ church. And so a lot of his initial political organizing really came out of mobilizing young people, particularly through social media. That was a particular moment. Then the pendulum sort of swung really in the other direction, which we see in terms of Trump, in terms of Brexit, in terms of Bolsonaro, in terms of various other strong right-wing nationalist leaders in several parts of the world. That's swung. Hopefully maybe it's swinging back again. I tended not to be too caught up in those things. I was one of those who was happy when Obama was elected, but not for 1 minute did I think that this heralded a post-racial new reality and somehow this was like King's dream now embodiment in them. I never believed that. And the reason I never believed that is two reasons. Firstly is that the pendulum does swing. It's not fixed. It swings from side to side, and therefore one always has to take each moment as a temporary moment for what it is. It's a temporary moment. Make the best of it. Try put seeds in place. Try put work in place that will outlast the swing in the other direction, but recognize that it's just a moment. Therefore, alongside that, my more considered thinking is that I'm working for the kingdom of God, for the reign of God, for the economy of God, whichever nomenclature you want to use for that which God's standards that are not reversible, they're permanent. And I think I love the quote from Martin Luther King where it says, like the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It bends in one direction. It's justice. It's just that it's a long arc, and there's going to be a long journey towards it. But it definitely goes in one direction. It's not reversible. It doesn't oscillate and vacillate. So it's not a set of values that says, well, actually, we believe in the preferential option for the poor, but only for now. But in 10 years' time, that will change our mind. That's not how the kingdom works. So for me, that's the permanent standard to which I'm working that sits in parallel with the vacillation of human experience that does change from place to place. So I tend to be fairly even-keeled. So I tend not to be overly exuberant when it's swinging in my direction because I know it won't last. But then at the same point, I try not to get too overwhelmed with despair when it swings against us, because I still believe that the agency of God and the transformative power of the Spirit is working in the midst, in whichever direction it is, in order to steer us on that moral arc that is long, but it definitely bends towards justice.
Thank you for that. That's both hopeful and really helpful, I think, for especially and reminding us not to also confuse those kind of more political and earthly moments of, hey, good news with this is God incarnate again, kind of thing, which I think is helpful. Just kind of a one final question, a little off topic, as we kind of get toward the end of the episode is, so you're a practical theologian. I know from your work how important like workshops and dialogue are to the work that you produce. So, I think it's very, it's tough to ask folks to reflect on church and COVID and isolation and theology and COVID and isolation within it, right? We're not going to know the full effect of the impact for a long time. But I was thinking about like, right now, probably a lot of the way you like to do theology and that you think theology should be done and explored just is impossible, right? And, so a lot of the work we're going to get is people kind of hauled up and just, well, I was going to do it by myself, I guess. So I'm just curious of your thoughts as a practical theologian on the unique challenges of being a practical theologian or being someone in the church seeking to help people with working through maybe some of that stuff we were talking about, like the way they've named themselves and maybe helping them to understand that there's some problems there and maybe there's more life in another kind of naming. How are you feeling about that work amidst all this? And
Oh yeah. I mean, it's been incredibly hard. It's been incredibly hard, and I think what I've simply had to try and do is to say that a lot of the work I'm doing comes in two different guises. So at one level, I've probably written more theoretical stuff of late than I've ever done in previous years. So some of it's just saying, well, I've not been able to kind of test this out to wrestle with it's in situ with people, so I'm just theorizing. At one level, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's what 90% of most theologians do anyway, is just to theorize, and they tend not to develop their work from engagement with real people on real context. So at one level, I've done that. At one level, it's actually been quite interesting because I've never really done that before. So I wasn't quite sure if I could do it. So I was actually quite pleased that I did a couple of published articles that were just very theoretical. They were me just thinking in my head, this is a particular question, how then does one wrestle through it and get to some kind of resolution at the end? And both got published. And so I guess, there's always a learning experience in anything. So I learned that the kind of more abstract intellectual, rational thinking stuff that I always thought was never my thing. Actually, I can do it. I mean, I don't love it, but I can do it. So, so that's been a good kind of revelation. So I suppose it gives me more strings to my bow. I think what it's also done as well, it has then just said to me that I long for the day when I can be back in community with people. That I have missed that. And as good as this particular medium is, because, I've been involved in more international stuff. And so quite a lot of stuff I've organized, the fact is like you can get people from all over the world to engage. So, so there are some good things that have come out of this. I don't want to lose that. That's been fantastic. But in the end, as a practical theologian, there's nothing really beats being with other people in a particular context, wrestling with ideas in that particular moment, where what is both constraining as well as what is liberating are the real stories that people bring, that then they become the template against which you are trying to test out whether something that you're saying is real or not. So, so actually even going back and revising Is God Colorblind was really quite momentous in one respect, because actually to go back to it, to go back over some of the exercises that were originally developed in community with people, and doing that and revising it now sat in your study by yourself at a point whereby I probably had literally not met another human being to touch for months, was a very weird kind of dissonance. So, so even going back and rereading it and amending it was to think back to the days when habitually I would see people almost every single day. And a lot of weekends I would be in a church or in a community meeting, and we would be trying out an idea and they will be responding and I will be recording their responses. I think the appetite to do that has only grown all the more by being in this particular lockdown moment. But as I said, there have been some learning from that. And as I said, I've learned that I can write in a different way if I really need to, and I can do it, and that's good. Will never be my preferred way, but it's nice to know that I can do it if I have to.
Yeah, that's great. No, yeah, that's awesome. So thank you so much for being on today, Anthony. I really appreciate your time. Folks, go and check out, go and buy, go and get for your library, Is God Colorblind? The new edition with the new afterword. And you can also check out a bunch of other books, both written and edited, Anthony, and you can, if you're really interested in, we've talked about Theologizing Brexit a couple of times, you can find that old interview somewhere in the feed. Anything else you want to promote or draw people's attention to?
Okay. This is so anyway, a blatant plug, and I found this out entirely by accident because the publisher didn't tell me, is that I was going on various websites trying to find something for a form I was filling in, and actually found out that the Routledge are bringing out a paperback version of Is God Colorblind in March.
Great. Wait, a paperback version of Is...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. A paperback version of Theologising Brexit.
Great.
Sorry.
Oh, that's so good to know. That's so good to know.
Brexit. So basically, it will go down from £120 down to £36.
Beauty. And it's definitely worth picking up, folks. It's one of my... it was such an incredible book filled with really good essays. So yes, now wait until then and then get it.
Yes, wait till March.
Yeah.
And the cost will be probably about a third of it. Yeah.
That's great. Oh, well, folks, thanks Anthony again. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening, folks. We'll see you next week.